This is, of course, a seminar, workshop, call it what you will, about 20 years of American history. And it's a fascinating period. I think all periods of history are fascinating in different ways, but what makes this particularly interesting, I think, is that it's a period of extremes in American history, and I think also in world history. And by the way, all along the next 3 days, I'll be making references to what's going on in the world as well, because after all, this is a period in between two wars, two of the biggest wars in history. And American history was influenced by those wars, so much so that really it's hard to think about the 20s and 30s without thinking about the influence of World War I before it and the influence of World War II brewing on the horizon after it. So what some of the sort of essential characteristics of this period? Well, I see it as, in some ways, an age of extremes. It's hard to find 2 decades in American history where you have such different politics, such different sort of cultural assumptions going on. Think about it. The 20s, the president for most of those years was a man named Calvin Coolidge, who I'll talk about a little more tomorrow. Coolidge famously said that he thought the business of America was business. And the progressive era reforms associated with Theodore Roosevelt, associated with William Jennings Bryan, though he wasn't president, but was a very influential figure in the Democratic Party, associated with Theodore Roosevelt, were many of them either rolled back or stymied by fairly conservative politicians, mostly Republicans, also some Democrats in the 20s. The income tax, which had been really, for the first time in American history, a serious tax that most Americans paid during World War I, is rolled back. So only a small group of Americans is paying income tax in the 20s. So in the 20s, you have, you might say, business in command. But in the 30s, after the Great Depression begins, big business especially, is in disrepute. And Republicans, of course, are no longer in command in the country politically. Democrats are in power, and Democrats who are proud to call themselves liberal Democrats. And of course, in the 30s, with the New Deal, you begin to see the permanent presence of a rather large government apparatus in American life. More and more, all problems that Americans have, or at least many problems they have, are being politicized. The federal government is involved in those, beginning in the 30s and going on to the present, I think. So you have a very conservative political era followed by a very liberal political era. You have a Republican majority supplanted by a Democratic majority with very different ideologies, very different kinds of people in power. Also, you have a real sort of extreme swing in terms of cultural history in this period. In the 20s, I'll talk about this after the first lecture today, you have a period that the great historian John Higham has called the tribal 20s. A period of tremendous ethnic and religious rivalries and hostilities, a time when for the first time you have a Catholic candidate, major party candidate for president in 1928, Al Smith, whose opponents are not at all shy about saying we can't have a Catholic in the White House because the Pope will take over. And Americans won't be running the government, the Pope and the Cardinals will be running the American government. And he loses for many reasons, Al Smith does, but certainly one of the reasons is that he was a Catholic. And lots of Protestant Democrats decide to vote Republican for the first time in their lives. Whereas in the 30s, you see, I think, the first serious beginnings of what today we would call multiculturalism. That is, a tolerance, even a celebration of different cultures, different religious cultures, different ethnic cultures, different racial cultures, all under the rubric of what I would call New Deal culture. I'll talk about that on Wednesday. So you have a tribal 20s, a time when a lot of Americans really have deep, deep mistrust for people of different ethnic groups, different racial groups, different religious groups. Where in the 30s, where that doesn't go away, of course, it hasn't gone away even today, but you have people in power who are committed, at least rhetorically, to doing away with a lot of those divisions, to Americans being one people across racial lines, across religious lines, and all those people being equal. And of course, underlying all this is the economic realities of this period, where you go from, right after World War I, as I'll talk about in a few minutes, a pretty deep recession where as much as 20% of the labor force is unemployed by 1921, to one of the most prosperous periods in American history throughout the 20s. And then, of course, you have the Great Depression, which is the longest and deepest depression in American history. And again, not to be forgotten, you go from Americans fighting in World War I, helping to win that war in Europe, and then being disillusioned by the results of that war. And then by the end of the period, World War II has begun, and there's a furious debate about whether the U.S. should enter this next war. So it's a period between the wars, between prosperity and depression, between Republican conservative dominance and liberal democratic dominance, and between a culture war of sorts and a desire, at least, for a cultural peace and a transcendence of those divisions. Now, I should say that despite the fact you've read these two thick books, or at least you've had these two thick books to read, I will not be holding a quiz on what's in the footnote of page 342 of Kennedy. But I'm not going to talk about the books except sort of in passing. My comments, my lectures will be really jumping off from the books, be highlighting some aspects of the history that are not covered in the books, some that are going into more detail and some that are. All I can say is this is what I think is most interesting and important about this period, the 6 talks that I'll be giving you and some of the readings we'll be doing. By the way, because because of the assessment and some of the technological problems, we'll not be doing the first discussion today about the new Negro. We'll be doing it first thing tomorrow, bright and early at 9 o'clock. So, any questions about that as a way of introduction? Again, whether I ask for questions or not, feel free to ask them at any time. You know, the dates of the course do go from 1917 to 1941, but to do justice to World War I would take half a course, at least two lectures. And so I can certainly answer questions about the U.S. during World War I and recommend to you David Kennedy's earlier book called Over Here, which is about the home front during World War I. But I'm going to start talking about this period by talking about the immediate year after the war ended. That is 1919. As it says here, how 1919 changed the world. And it changed the world because PowerPoint was not invented yet, so. let's make believe that there's no PowerPoint. I know it's hard to remember those days, you know. Remember transparencies, remember overhead projectors, remember those days? Anyway. 1919. 1919 is one of those years on which history seems to hinge. A year like 1789, the year of the French Revolution, a year like 1848, the year of many revolutions in Europe against monarchies, a year like 1939, World War II began, then 1968, when there were uprisings in many parts of the world, on both sides of the Iron Curtain. 1919 is a year that seemed to, open up possibilities and foreclose a lot as well. If I had a lamp here, I show you a picture of the 4 main makers of the Versailles Treaty, the peace treaty in Europe. World War I ended November 11th, 1918, with an armistice. Not an actual surrender, by the way, an armistice. And 1919, the victorious powers met at that beautiful chateau that Louis XIV built for himself outside Paris in Versailles, and signed and came up with a peace treaty, which included a League of Nations, a new Federation of Nations, not a world government, but a Federation of Nations, which committed themselves, at least the leaders committed themselves, to having a voluntary force of different nations, military force, which would try to stop small wars before they became large wars, They set up a world court and various other parts of sort of a world federation of nations. And there was talk, a lot of talk, about doing away with empires that these victorious nations had. The French in Africa and Asia, the British in Africa and Asia, the Italians in North Africa, and so forth. But the only empire that was really broken up were the empires of those who lost World War I. The Germans, the Austro-Hungarians, and the Turks, so-called Central Powers. The French and the British said, we won the war. We're not going to give up our empire. And so there was a lot of unhappiness, of course, among Indians and Vietnamese and Africans who did not get independence as some of them thought they were going to get, with the great promises that President Woodrow Wilson especially was making. But at the same time, and Americans also were quite disillusioned, believing what their president had said, that this was going to be a war to make the world safe for democracy. They were going to win a peace without victory. Self-determination of all nations was going to be one of the goals of World War I. Well, for the most part, that did not come to pass unless you happen to live in one of the small nations like what became Czechoslovakia, which had been controlled by one of the losing powers in the war. And something else happened because of the end of World War I, partly because of disillusionment, partly because of the sacrifices that so many men and women had made during the war. The rule, the domination of the older ruling elites in many parts of the world were being thrown into question. 1919 was a year of revolution. Failed revolutions, successful revolutions, a lot of talk of revolution. In Germany, there was a failed revolution in Berlin, and also one in Munich, down in the southern part of Germany, in Bavaria. In Italy, there were factory takeovers all over the northern part of Italy, the industrial district of Italy, by radical socialists, trying to start a revolution much like the one that had taken power in Russia in 1917. In Hungary, there was a socialist republic that was founded and stayed around for 3 or 4 months till it was overthrown. In China, there was a movement called the May 4th movement, which was protest against foreign powers, especially the Japanese, who were trying to take over parts of coastal China after 1919. Out of this May 4th movement in China was founded the Communist Party, led among other people by a guy named Mao Zedong. And also in 1919, for the first time, you had the consolidation of a socialist government, a so-called workers' and farmers' government, that, of course, in Russia. Not yet the USSR, still Soviet Russia, it was called. It didn't become the USSR until a little bit later. 1919, the communists who control, of course, the government in Russia. It's not yet a one-party government, by the way, but it's on the way there. The communists are beginning to put people in jail who are from other parties besides their own. 1919, the communists in Russia decide they're going to form a new international revolutionary organization called the Communist International, and they're going to make a demand on all socialists around the world. Socialism, of course, had been in existence for almost 100 years by 1919 in different forms. And there were large socialist parties which ran in elections in their countries. In this country, Socialist Party under Eugene V. Debs. In other countries, much larger and more popular socialist parties than ever existed here. The Communist International, 1919, says this has got to stop. We have to move towards revolution. Everybody has to adopt the Communist Party, much like the Communist Party in the Soviet Union, with a small group in power at the top who basically makes the decisions. No more messing around with reform, no more messing around with changing lives of people in capitalism a little bit here, a little bit there. We have to gear ourselves up for revolutions happening all over the world. That's when the Communist International, the Comintern, is born. And it splits left-wing parties all over the world. Some remain socialist and remain, committed to democracy and electoral politics and gradual change. Some join the communists and are committed to revolution, if not right away, very soon. The United States, there's a lot of fear that a revolution will happen here, and that there'll be violence here, and there is some violence, as I talk about in a minute. But in general, the period after World War I, the immediate period, is a period of a move towards the right, not a move towards the left at all. Republicans had taken control of Congress in 1918, the first time they controlled Congress since before Woodrow Wilson was president. And it's pretty clear that unless something amazing happens, that the Republicans will win the presidential election in 1920. The big debate is who they'll nominate. They end up nominating a guy, and you can see he's a very dark man. Warren G. Harding, a senator from Ohio, whose main claim to fame was that he looked like a president. So I wish I could show it to you, but I think you can see photos of Harding all over the place. He had nicely groomed white hair. He had a way of holding his chin up in a very distinguished fashion. He didn't make a mistake of writing his own speeches, which Wilson did. Wilson was a brilliant speechwriter. Harding was not, so he knew enough to hire good speechwriters. And when Harding wins in a landslide in 1920, he wins on a platform, or I should say a slogan, of normalcy, which is not a very good English word for those English teachers out there, but somehow it sounded good, After the war and the disillusionment that followed the war, after the reform fervor of the progressive years, which really begin soon after 1900 and don't end until World War I itself, Harding said we can get back to normal life again. No one's going to be pushing you to make big changes. No one's going to be trying to change the lives of Americans. No one's going to be trying to empower groups who have not had much power before. Let's just get back to business. However, under the surface in American life, and sometimes not so far under the surface, there were a lot of tensions, a lot of antagonisms, a lot of hatreds, it's fair to say, and a lot of fears that a majority of Americans had. On the one hand, you had a lot of people, industrial workers, radical intellectuals, African Americans, especially those who came back from World War I, expecting that because they'd served and sacrificed for the country, that they'd be able to live as equal citizens in this country, who were demanding changes in American life beyond what they'd been able to achieve earlier in the century. And they came into conflict in different ways, as we'll see, with the majority of Americans who feared the changes that this minority was demanding. And they also feared and were very suspicious of the people who were demanding them. So the majority of Americans in 1919, 1920, were uneasy about the kind of things happening overseas, revolution being in the air and on the ground in Europe and in Asia. At the same time, they were uneasy about people in this country who seemed like they wanted to replicate some of the things that were happening overseas. What were they so afraid of? That's the question. And how did they respond? And what was the impact of their response on American society? Well, first of all, some anecdotes, some illustrations of their fears. A clothing store salesman in Connecticut in early 1919 was sentenced to 6 months in jail for telling a customer that Vladimir Lenin was the brainiest or one of the brainiest political leaders in the world. It wasn't quite clear which he actually said. 6 months in jail. At a victory loan pageant in D.C., where the government was trying to raise money to pay back its debts, citizens buying bonds, a man refused to rise for the playing of the Star-Spangled Banner. Now, this was a new custom. The Star-Spangled Banner was not played at public events until World War I. This was a patriotic gesture which really began in World War I. Star-Spangled Banner, as you know, is a song about a war, about the War of 1812, about the attack on Fort McHenry in Baltimore, near where I live. And so it seemed an appropriate song to become what we now call the national anthem. But it was not, in fact, made into the national anthem by Congress until 1931. So the idea of standing for the Star-Spangled Banner was still something very new in American life. And one can imagine this man who refused to stand did not know that. Well, there was an angry sailor behind him who was enraged by the fact this guy wasn't standing up, and he shot him in the back. And as he fell, the crowd cheered wildly. There's an Immigration Act passed in 1920, the first of 3 very restrictive immigration acts, trying to roll back what had been a very tremendous rise of immigration in the years before World War I. Immigration Act passed in 1920, which decreed that aliens who possessed literature or gave money to radical organizations like the New Communist Party, which was formed in 1919, I'll get to that in a minute, could be immediately deported. Now, the courts, looking this over in a cooler time, declared this unconstitutional. After all, you know, it's not illegal to pass out literature in America based on the First Amendment. But the Immigration Act tried to make it illegal. And the man who was the chairman of the Immigration Committee in the House, a congressman named Albert Johnson from the state of Washington, was impatient with civil libertarians, like the civil libertarians of a new organization founded just during World War I, which you've probably heard of, called the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, which was founded explicitly to defend people who were being attacked for opposing World War I. That's not why the ACLU was formed. Johnson was impatient with the civil libertarians who were objecting to the banning of radical literature and the banning of radical newspapers, too. Johnson said, "The free press is ours, not theirs. Free speech is ours, not theirs. And they have gone just as far as we can let them go towards running over our most precious rights." Interesting. Free press is ours, not theirs, but they're running over our precious rights. So there's a small rights and there's a larger sense of rights that Johnson had, obviously. Well, this is not the first or last time, as you probably know, those of you who teach American history, that Americans have become obsessed with fear of a radical foreign menace. The first time was in the early years of the Republic, in the late 1790s, when there was almost a war between the U.S. and France, during the time when Napoleon was rising to power in France and making war on his neighbors. And Congress passed the Alien and Sedition Acts, which made it almost impossible for recent immigrants to become citizens, which banned certain kinds of speech. And the backlash against those acts helped to elect Thomas Jefferson president in 1800. 1850s, the Know-Nothing Party, formerly known as the American Party, was exercised by what they saw as a Catholic plot to take over the government. And they were powerful enough in their anti-immigrant and especially anti-Catholic protests that they were elected, Know-Nothings were elected to run the legislatures of several states, including Massachusetts. And of course, there was the so-called McCarthy era of the late 1940s and early 1950s, fear of communists in American life, at a time when the Communist Party existed, but it was actually declining very quickly. All of these great fears had in common several things. First of all, they all reacted towards not just radical organizations, but towards radical kinds of thinking, radical modes of expression. What they saw also as a crisis in society that necessitated measures which might not be completely democratic, might not be completely according to the letter of the Constitution, but were necessary to save American lives, perhaps, and American institutions, which were under great stress. All of these great fears in American history took various instances of threats, whether some anarchists setting bombs, whether some Catholics saying that they really were more beholden to the Pope than they were to the American president, say in the 1850s. Some Americans supporting the French Revolution in the 1790s instead of, and believing that another revolution was necessary here. They took various unconnected instances of danger and saw a vast conspiracy by all groups that were, in their minds, opposed to American institutions, opposed to the American Constitution, and believed that better safe than sorry, better off to cut down as much as possible, whether constitutionally or unconstitutionally, on these dangerous groups than to let them grow and grow and grow so that they would generate a real threat to America. The first fear, and probably the one that is most pervasive among most Americans, wherever they lived, was that America was a society with too many new immigrant groups who didn't understand American ways and didn't agree with the ones they did understand. As you probably know, the period from the 1880s up until World War I was a period of the greatest immigration in American history. As you can see from the table. At one point, don't worry about it, I'm kidding. I'm just, you lecture, you have certain rhythm, you go slides and back and forth. So. For example, between 1904 and 1910, close to 1 million new immigrants came in every year to the United States. And of course, the population base was much smaller at that time. My grandparents came from what's now Belarus, one in 1905, one in 1907, and they settled in communities that were completely full of immigrants like themselves, Jewish immigrants in this case. And lots of immigrants lived here for a long time without knowing English. Their children, for the most part, learned English, but a lot of the immigrants did not. And of course, a lot of workplaces were, especially industrial workplaces and some mines, some docks, where the workforce was predominantly immigrant and the children of recent immigrants as well. And that, some of the major industries in America were that way. The steel industry, for example, a majority of immigrants or their children. And that was perhaps the most important industry in America at that time. So there was a real backlash among non-immigrant Americans and sometimes immigrants from older immigrant backgrounds, Irish, some English, Scots, some Norwegians, who felt that all these immigrants were turning America into a different kind of place, and they didn't like that. Germans, of course, were a special target during the war itself, because many Germans had opposed the U.S. going to war with Germany. I'm sure you've heard about various anecdotes. Some people wanted to rename sauerkraut victory cabbage. And there were various, many towns where Germans sometimes were a very large minority, even majority. The city fathers got together and banned teaching of German in schools, banned the playing of Bach and Beethoven in the local concert hall, and made people kiss the flag to prove that they loved America. This didn't just happen to Germans, by the way. It also happened to some Italians, some Slavic people as well. And Prohibition, which I'll talk about later on today, became law right after World War I, but it was passed by a wartime Congress during World War I, not only by any means because of a fear of immigrant drinkers and brewers and others, but certainly the divisions between those who supported Prohibition and those who opposed Prohibition did often line up ethnically and religiously. Native-born white Protestants most white Protestant denominations were very supportive of Prohibition, especially the more evangelical ones, Methodists, Presbyterians, Baptists in particular. Lutherans, like many people in Minnesota, were not very crazy about Prohibition, especially those from German background. But it was very popular among the largest denominations in America, but very unpopular among Catholics, among Jews, among Eastern Orthodox people. During World War I, the government had tried to mobilize this sort of Americanist feeling in a positive sense through a group called the Committee on Public Information, or the CPI, run by a progressive fellow named George Creel. And they were the government's main task, main effort during the war was to try to assimilate these recent immigrants, so many of whom were important to the war effort, after all, who were making a lot of the munitions that were being used by the doughboys, the American soldiers going over to Europe to fight. So they made it easier for people to become citizens. They had English classes. They passed out leaflets in various languages, not just English, encouraging immigrant workers to feel like they should know the Constitution, they should know something about American history, they should become citizens, to see themselves as equal Americans. But after the war ended, Americanism lost much of its reformist, inclusive character. And the very term Americanism grew a prefix, 100%, Americanism. And many of the more active Americanists in 1919 were really much more interested in keeping immigrants, especially immigrants who were questioning the way American society worked, in their place. Unfortunately, one of the most active groups was a group that now is completely, respectable, of course, and respected. That is the American Legion. The American Legion was founded partly by a son of Theodore Roosevelt, and one of the reasons it was called the American Legion was to make clear everyone knew that this was a patriotic organization which was going to promote an idea of conformity to American values. 100% Americans is what the American Legion wanted, or 100%ers, as it was shortened to. The American Legion was often involved in beating up radical union organizers, harassing radicals when they sold newspapers on the streets, sometimes going into homes of immigrants who were suspected of radical activity and looking what kind of literature they had in their homes. It was only later on, into the 20s, that the American Legion becomes a real veteran service organization. But at the beginning, it was very much a political organization, and the politics of the Legion was very clear. Now, part of the impetus for these ex-soldiers' actions was fear itself. That is, the economy was in very bad shape after the war was over. 4 million men had been drafted. They weren't in the military very long. The U.S. declared war on Germany in the spring of 1917. The draft took a while to really get going. Most people didn't get to Europe until 1918, and the fighting the U.S. took part in, which was very bloody and very important to the progress of the war, lasted about 6 months, 7 months. Most of these men who were in the military expected to come back to their jobs that they had before. And they were quite unhappy when the jobs either weren't there or someone else had taken their jobs. Sometimes an immigrant, too. Because one of the anomalies about the war is that one of the reasons why the government pushed so hard during the war to Americanize the immigrants was that immigrants were disproportionately disqualified from the draft during the war. Why? For not knowing English, not being able to hear the orders from their officers. You need to know the language your officer is speaking. For failing what were then pretty stringent physical exams. A lot of immigrants had very bad health. They worked 60, 70, 80 hours a week. They had TB, they had various other diseases, and they couldn't pass the physical exams. So more Native Americans, disproportionately served in the military, were drafted into the military during the World War I than immigrants were. And that increased the protests of veterans when they came back. Also, as I mentioned before, a short but sharp depression broke out at the end of 1919. And by 1921, 20% of the labor force was unemployed. And at first, the depression was accompanied by inflation, continuing inflation. Usually we think recessions, depressions, prices go down. Either they stabilize or they drop. You have deflation. But for a while, prices actually went up, 77% in 1919 over the levels of 1914. So this, of course, just added to the pain that people felt. And so the stage was set for both the activity of radicals, I should say, who were themselves responding to what was going on, and a fear of what they were doing. But before I go into that, any questions, comments, what I've said so far? I'm trying not to assume too much knowledge, but you're all teachers and you all have a lot of knowledge. So I never know where the pockets of doubt happen to be. But please, anytime you have a question or a comment, as I said, please ask it. Question? No? Okay. Okay, the most widespread fear, as I said, was of a radical conspiracy to overthrow the government. And what made it plausible to many people was that there were, in fact, communist parties, not just one, but two communist parties formed in 1919. The Socialist Party in America, which had been a fairly large party by the standards of American radical history. Eugene V. Debs, the socialist who ran for president 5 times before World War I, got 6% of the vote in 1912, running on a very radical platform. And socialists before World War I were pretty popular in places like Oklahoma, Nevada, Oregon, Louisiana, Texas. In fact, the highest socialist vote before World War I in this country of any state, in terms of percentage vote, was in Oklahoma, which surprises a lot of people. Small tenant farmers, miners were very attracted to the idea of redistributing wealth, and that was the major socialist, major plank in the socialist platform. But in 1919, because of the Comintern demand that all socialists make a decision, are you with the Soviet Union or are you with those crazy, cowardly, I should say, reformists? There were 2 communist parties formed, one called the Communist Labor Party and one called the Communist Party. You don't need to know the small details of why they were 2 different parties. But generally, one was more native-born radicals, one was more immigrant radical. But they both swore allegiance to the Comintern. Altogether, the 2 parties had 60,000 members. Not a menace to the system. But as always in history, think of the context. Revolutions were happening in Europe. The Versailles Treaty had disillusioned people. There was no reason to think necessarily that all those immigrants who were in those factories, who didn't speak English, who read newspapers that were not in English, no reason for native-born Americans growing up knowing only English to think that maybe these people really are supportive of the Communist Party. Maybe they really do want to replicate what Lenin and Trotsky did in Russia. And what made them even more nervous were some events that did happen in 1919 and 1920. That were, seemed to show that maybe a revolution could be beginning. First of all, there was the largest strike wave in American history in 1919. 1/5 of all wage earners were out on strike at some time in 1919. Now, most of them were not radicals at all. They wanted higher wages to keep up with inflation, and above all, they wanted union recognition. Because in 1919, you could form a union, nothing wrong with that, but there was no assurance that that union would be recognized by the employer. There was no government mechanism, as there was beginning in the mid-1930s, for an election to be held by the government. Basically, the union wanted to make it, it had to be strong. It had to be strong enough to defeat the attempts by its employers to defeat it. And many strikes were, in effect, little wars. The term class war gets thrown around all the time now by different, different politicians. But there were little instances of what you might call class war in America, really into the into the 1930s and into the 1940s even. Not much since then. 1919, 400,000 steel workers went out. The most important industry in any industrial society, at least at the time, was shut down. And employers basically went to war against it. They brought out, they supported the bringing out of the police. National Guard came out to stop meetings by, usually peaceful meetings by the union, which was trying to sign up steel workers. There was a nationwide textile strike. There was a nationwide coal strike. There was a nationwide railroad strike. And there were radical agitators or organizers who were in charge of some of these strikes. The leader of the steelworkers strike was a guy named William Z. Foster, Irish Catholic guy from Philadelphia, who later on goes on to become a leader of the Communist Party. He was not yet in the Communist Party then, but he certainly had a radical past in other radical groups. And the most alarming strike of all, perhaps, was one that took place among a group you never would have expected to go on strike, the police force of Boston, Massachusetts. This was a group that was legally barred from striking. The other groups were not barred from striking. Their strikes could be put down, but they, if they got violent, but they were not barred from striking legally, but public workers were, and of course in many cases still are in this country, barred from striking. And so this was a symbol of anarchy on the loose. These were mostly Irish Catholic workers who were supposed to be putting down radicals. They weren't supposed to be going on strike themselves. The governor of Massachusetts at the time was a man named Calvin Coolidge. And Coolidge sent in the National Guard, or the militia, as it was called then, to break the strike. And his resulting popularity from this act, this decisive act, helped to make him a star in Republican Party circles and was very important into making him the vice presidential candidate in 1920. And of course, as that vice presidential candidate, he becomes president when Warren G. Harding dies of a heart attack in 1923. So Calvin Coolidge is president thanks to the Boston police going on strike. It's almost that direct. There's also a more direct threat, besides, and more visceral threat, perhaps, besides the strikes themselves. A few anarchists, who, as you know, are not the same as communists. Anarchists don't believe in any government. They don't want a strong government. They want no government. A few anarchists tried to start the revolution all by themselves. In June 1919, they set off bombs in 9 cities in the same week. A number of them were duds. Only a couple people were hurt. But nevertheless, this was, obviously scary stuff. A year later, in 1920, the largest explosion took place on Wall Street. Wall Street basically exploded. Anarchists were suspected of that bombing, but nobody was ever indicted, much less convicted, for that crime. But 18 people died in the Wall Street explosion in 1920. So all this was unsettling to people who, majority of Americans, who basically wanted all this turmoil to go away, not to keep growing. And all these fears received a catharsis of sorts in early 1920. When the Attorney General of the United States, a guy named A. Mitchell Palmer, who was a very ambitious man and wanted to run for president in 1920, Woodrow Wilson already served 2 terms. He was in bed from a stroke. Clearly, Wilson wasn't going to even think of running for a 3rd term. And so the Democratic nomination was open in 1920. And Palmer wanted to run for it. And he thought, in the midst of all these crises, all these fears, all this violence, all these strikes, just like as Coolidge became a popular star among Republicans, he wanted to become a Democratic Coolidge, in effect. And he was Attorney General, so he had some troops at his disposal. In the first months of 1920, he ordered the raids of homes, offices, and businesses of those he deemed dangerous alien radicals. And these raids, the Palmer raids, as they were known, were under the direct supervision of a 24-year-old employee of the Justice Department, whose name would become quite well known later on. Anybody know who he was? J. Edgar Hoover, yes. I have a great photo of him in his police uniform at about this time. Boy from Washington, D.C., by the way. Grew up along the Potomac River. 6,000 aliens were rounded up for possible deportation, and preparations were made to arrest thousands more. even though there was no legal right to do so. No warrants were sworn out to search their offices and their homes. And so most of these cases were thrown out. But it had, you know, its desired effect. Some radicals stopped being active. Some immigrants actually went back to their home countries, being afraid of being locked up if they didn't. Now, Palmer looked like he was in great shape, except he sort of upped the ante, as sometimes politicians tend to do, as you know. They say, well, something worked, maybe I'll try a little something beyond that. After the Palmer raids were over, Palmer predicted that he had inside information that there was going to be an attempt at a revolution, a takeover of the government in Washington, D.C. on May Day, 1920, the radical socialist holiday around the world. Uprising was going to be there. People were geared ready. The National Guard in various places were ready to come. The Army was being told to get ready. May 1st, 1920, the uprising didn't happen. After that, Palmer's reputation was not very high anymore, and his chances for being nominated president were pretty much gone. But the whole anti-radical crusade demonstrated multiple and overlapping fears of radicals, of unruly workers, of aliens. In combination, again, a conspiracy seemed possible. After all, there was a new Communist Party which was saying it wanted to make a revolution. There were some anarchist bombs that were set off. There were radicals in charge of some of the strikes. And the economic instability, above all of it, and the returning soldiers demoralized, feeling like, what do we fight this war for anyway if we don't have jobs? If all these workers back home are going on strike, if the economy is not good, was a perfect soil for this great fear. And there's also another major threat, something which goes much further back in American history than socialism ever does. And that was a threat from, a supposed threat from a non-white race, African Americans in particular. One of the most frightening changes for many white Americans that the war had brought was that a lot of African Americans, 500,000 in fact, had moved up north from mostly rural southern areas, Mississippi Delta and Carolinas and Georgia, rural areas, moving to cities, not just northern cities, but southern cities too, but especially northern cities, making Chicago and New York and San Francisco and Los Angeles places with a sizable black population, really, for the first time in their history. Philadelphia, Cleveland as well. The beginning of what we think of as urban ghettos, black urban ghettos, really dates from World War I, from what's called the Great Migration. And this migration continues through the 20s, and after taking somewhat of a pause in the 1930s during the Depression, continues again in the 40s and 50s, to the point where a lot of major cities, of course, are predominantly black. Atlanta, Washington, D.C., and others. There was the tinder here for racial clashes, because on the one hand, black people were moving north with great hopes of getting good jobs in war industries, with great hopes of getting out from under the Jim Crow system of brutal segregation, which was not just about not being able to eat at lunch counters and drink from the same fountains and go to the same bathrooms as white people. It was also about not being able to get good jobs, not being able to get loans from banks, not being able to buy decent housing, and so forth. And they moved often into working class areas that were full of white factory workers, sometimes recent immigrants, sometimes not, who were not used to having black people around them, who had learned by being Americans for a while that black people were supposed to be inferior to white people. And so this set up a clash right here. Competition for jobs set in, especially after the war, when jobs began to disappear. So you had a hopeful black population who comes to the northern cities and is disillusioned by what they find, and they're disillusioned partly because of the hostility and fear of the white working class people who they come to live among and work among. So, and part of it too is that a lot of the people moving to the cities were either related to or themselves were military veterans. military veterans are very important, black military veterans are a very important part of the sort of new black militancy, which you've read about in the document. We'll talk about first thing tomorrow. The document by the Congregational minister called The New Negro. When he's hit, he hits back, if you've read that one. So hitting back and hitting were very much going on in the cities in 1919. There were, actually, there was an earlier race riot in East St. Louis, in Illinois, right across from St. Louis in 1917. There were smaller race riots in other cities. But the biggest one happened in Chicago in the summer of 1919. And it happened on one of those days, if you've been in Chicago in the summer, 95 degrees, really muggy, can't wait for the thunderstorm, but it doesn't come. As many people as possible went down to the beaches, on Lake Michigan, which was a cheap form of, leisure, of course, for people who didn't have much money. But there was an unofficial line on these beaches separating the white beaches, which is most of the beaches, from the black beach. There was segregation in Chicago on the beaches. And all the adults pretty much knew to respect that line, though, of course, blacks grumbled about it. Well, one July day in 1919, a black kid, 12, 13 years old, out in the water, swam across the unofficial line in the water between the white beach and the black beach. And some of the white kids on the white beach started to heckle him and threw stones at him, not probably intending to hurt him badly, but just intending to get him, back to the nigger's side, as they said. One of the white kids was a pretty good aim, unfortunately, and he threw a rock which killed the black kid. This death, amid days of humid temperatures, amid all the people on the beaches, amid the fears and tension after World War I that I've been talking about, set off 5 days of really very bloody violence. Gangs of whites and blacks went into each other's neighborhoods in cars and on foot and on streetcars, randomly stabbing and shooting and beating their victims to death. There are photos, which I've got on PowerPoint, and you can look at, of course, on the web, too. Newspaper photographers showing white mobs, taking big clubs and smashing, black people who were going like this, a few of blacks attacking whites as well. This was very unlike if some of you lived through and know something about the riots in the 1960s in places like Watts and in Los Angeles and in Newark and Detroit, other places. That was almost entirely black people in their own neighborhoods, destroying things in their neighborhoods and attacking police when they came in to try to stop it. This race riot was a real race riot. Those aren't 60s were not race riots, really. Black people were race, but they were not rioting against whites specifically, at least the whites they could see. But the Chicago race riot was a race riot. White and black people trying to get each other. In the end, 38 people died, and over 500 were badly injured. And that was really the impetus for articles like the one that Hart has, that we'll talk about tomorrow, was really the beginning of a new sense of black militancy. It's after this riot that Marcus Garvey, the immigrant from Jamaica, founds a group called the United Negro Improvement Association. And a lot of people, black people, join the organization partly because they want protection. They want a sense that if something happens, there's a group which is going to come in and do something about it. And finally, African Americans lose the possibility for a good 40 years of being assimilated into American urban society. That is, American dominant white urban society. Their communities that they move into become ghettos. The South Side stops being integrated, whites and blacks, and becomes almost all black. White realtors and property owners collaborate in various ways to keep blacks from moving out of their neighborhoods. There are restrictive covenants that are put on deeds. There used to be one on the first house I ever bought, which was no longer operative by the time I bought the house, but it basically said this house cannot be sold to a person not of the Caucasian race. Sometimes they even said not of Caucasian race and Christian religion, but usually it was just racial, not religious. And the reaction to this was the Garvey movement, in part, and was a new wave of black militancy in general. So this period then helps to set the stage for the 20s. And a lot of what happens in the 20s, as we'll see in a minute, has to be understood as a tremendous cultural divide and cultural clashes in the midst of general prosperity.